The bus hummed through the mountains like a soft-voiced animal, patient and steady. Pines pressed close to the road, black-green against the pale winter sky. Snow did not fall that morning, but the cold lay over the world in a thin, silver hush. Nora sat by the window with a small bag in her lap and a folded scrap of paper held between her palms, as if it were precious, or dangerous, or both. She watched the way the trees opened sometimes, giving brief views of a frozen stream or a field, stubbled with frost. Every now and then, a crow lifted from a branch and flew parallel to the bus, then veered off toward some secret roost. She had been awake most of the night. It showed in her face, though she kept her head down, and in the way her shoulders would not let go of their tension. It had been a week of hard words and hard silence, and before that, months of a slow dread that settled deeper in her with each appointment, each look from her parents, each whispering neighbor in the grocery store. A doctor with kind eyes had said she likely would not be able to have children. A fiancé who used to bring her sunflowers and sit with her on the front steps had said he was sorry and that it was too much for him. And then her parents, their pride a fragile thing, had taken money from a man in town and called it helping her. Helping her. That was the word they used when they arranged for her to go to him, to work for him, to belong to him in ways that turned her stomach. That was the word they used when they closed the door behind her and would not meet her eyes. She had left with all the quiet she could muster, which is to say, she left like a shadow slips through a room when a candle goes out. In the grey hour before dawn, she walked away from the house she grew up in, down a road she could walk in her sleep, and into a bus station that smelled of coffee, engine exhaust, and faint bleach. It was there, while the bus warmed and a woman, in a green coat, wiped down the ticket counter, that she saw the paper pinned to the bulletin board under a crooked thumbtack. Help wanted, it said, mountain home, for kids, room and board, small pay, must be willing to learn. There was a phone number at the bottom, written neatly above a tier of little fringed slits where numbers could be taken. One of the fringes was missing, as if someone else had considered it and then changed their mind. Nora read the paper twice. She stood there with her breath slow in her chest, as if breathing were a ritual she had to relearn. Her hand reached out and tore off another fringe before she could talk herself out of it. She slid the little strip into the pocket of her coat and counted the cash she had left. Then she bought a coffee so hot it made her lips sting, and went to the payphone by the vending machines. The line rang twice. She heard the sound of wind or distance on the other end, and then a man's voice, low, careful, as if he had to measure out the words and make sure they fit. Caleb, he said simply, and nothing else. Hello, Nora said. She could hear her own heartbeat. My name is Nora. I'm calling about the help wanted, with the kids. There was a pause, and then a very soft sigh. You sound cold, the man said. She could almost hear him realize how that sounded, and he cleared his throat with a small, embarrassed noise. I mean, sorry, yes, the AD. I didn't expect a call this morning. Where are you? The station in town, she said. She read out the name on the wall over the schedule. I can wait. Another pause. She could hear the quiet around him, like the hush of trees. Then, I can be there in 40 minutes. Old green pickup. If you change your mind, it's all right. Nora hung up and stood there with the receiver still warm against her hand. She was aware of how little of her life was arranged now. She was aware of the way her stomach twisted with hunger and fear. But the idea of not moving, of going back, felt like drowning. He arrived when he said he would. The truck was a battered green with a dent in the side and a plow attachment leaning tiredly in the back. The man who stepped out wore a work jacket and a wool cap. He was tall, with a beard that had more red in it than she expected, and eyes that were steady in the way of people who do one thing at a time and do it fully. He lifted his hand and waved in a small way that said he did not want to startle her. Nora, he asked. His voice in person had a different warmth than the phone. Like a wood stove that has been burning all day, she nodded. Caleb, yeah. He glanced toward her small bag, toward the way she stood slightly sideways, ready to flee. Something in his face softened. You want to sit somewhere warm and talk first. There's a diner next door. I don't need to take you anywhere you don't want to go. At the counter, they sat with their elbows barely on the formica, not touching, the way strangers do when they are trying not to scare each other away. The waitress poured coffee and did not ask questions. Caleb took off his cap and ran a hand through his hair. He did not ask Nora for a story. Instead, he told her a few plain facts. He worked at the mill outside town and kept the house up himself. His wife Lila had died 2 years ago. He had 4 children who needed breakfasts and boots and someone to remind them about math homework. And he was not very good at all those things at once. I can pay what I can, he said. Not much. You'd have a room, a door with a lock. You'd help with the kids, some cooking, some putting one foot in front of the other. I'm not looking for more than that. I'm not looking for a mother for them. Nobody replaces Lila, but we need another adult in the house. Nora felt the words door with a lock like a hand on her shoulder. She nodded. I don't have references, she said, and her voice was small. I've never been much for them, he said with a half smile. I go on what I see. You look like you could use a place to be. He did not look at her with pity. He did not look at her like a man making a calculation. He signed the check with a large, blocky signature and stood. We can try it, he said. You try it. If it doesn't work, I'll drive you back to the station myself. The road to his house was a ribbon of black ice and gravel, winding into hills where the trees grew so close, the sky became a narrow thing. The truck smelled faintly of chain oil and old pine. Nora kept her bag at her feet and watched the view sharpen and fall behind. Caleb pointed out the turn to the school, the grocery where everyone said hello whether you wanted them to or not, the church with a white steeple that looked new against an old, worn building. He spoke in a quiet voice that did not press her for answers. When they reached the house, it seemed to rise out of the earth rather than sit on it. The log walls were dark with age. Smoke lifted in a thin line from the chimney and faded into the sky. A woodpile like a low wall ran all along one side of the porch. Nora saw a sled leaning against the railing, two small scarves forgotten on the steps, and the first impression that rose in her chest was one of human weather. The door swung open before they reached it, and children spilled out into the cold, as if the air had buoyed them. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12 or 13. He stood a step behind the group, cautious, letting his younger siblings bounce ahead of him. Next came a girl with hair like corn silk and a missing front tooth, her grin wild and brave. A smaller boy clutched a battered stuffed bear to his chest and peered at Nora with solemn eyes. The last was a little girl whose hair had been pulled into two puffs that had escaped their bands and sprung free. She wore mismatched socks and no shoes, and she jumped up and down on the boards like a small drum. Shoes, Rose, the older boy said, and the child made a face at him and dashed back inside. These are mine, Caleb said, his voice different now, lighter in a way Nora almost didn't recognize. Owen, Molly, Levi, and Rose. This is Nora, she's here to help. She's going to try us out for a while, like a test, Molly asked. We're not good at tests, not like that. Caleb knelt to meet her eyes. We're going to be kind and easy, that's all. Inside, the heat wrapped around them like a blanket. The main room held a long couch with a worn quilt thrown over the back and a low table covered in crayon drawings and a chessboard left mid-game. A wood stove clanked softly to itself. The kitchen was part of the same space, as if the house knew. There was no use in dividing the acts of living from the place where living happened. Nora's room was down a short hallway, a small space with a window facing the trees, a bed with another quilt, a hook on the wall for coats, a lamp with a green shade waited on the bedside table. She set her bag down and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch of the door, feeling the simple weight of it. She heard Caleb's voice low in the main room. She's here to help, he said. She's not here to be your mother. Nobody can be your mother but your mother. We're going to be decent and we're going to try. Owen's voice, softer than she expected for his size, replied, Okay, Dad. At dinner, Nora learned that Levi loved puzzles, that Molly collected small creatures in her pockets and often forgot them until bedtime, and that Rose thought pepper flakes were confetti for food. Owen ate carefully and watched her, not unkindly, but like someone responsible for a small country might watch a stranger approaching the border. Caleb scooped stew into bowls and handed out bread without ever sitting down until everyone had a plate. When he finally took his own seat, he looked tired and content at the same time, as if both had become his usual companions. The next morning, Nora woke before the sun and lay still for a while, listening. The house had a different kind of silence than the bus had. This one was made of held breaths, of kettles coming to slow boil, of the scratch of a pencil in a far room. She got up and pulled on a sweater and padded into the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. A single light over the sink cast a circle of gold. She took a breath, then another, then set about making pancakes. She found flour in a tin with a dent in its side, eggs in a carton that had a smear of jam from someone's small hand. She stirred batter while the first morning light drew thin lines across the floorboards. By the time Rose shuffled in with her hair sticking up like a crown, the smell of butter and batter warmed the room. Rose dragged a chair to the counter and climbed up like a sailor boarding a ship. I can stir, she announced. I am very good at stirring. Good, Nora said, and handed her the whisk. That was how it began. Not with a plan, not with a speech, but with pancakes and winter light. With a child at a counter and a woman who had told herself she would never belong anywhere again. In the days that followed, Nora learned where the socks disappeared to under the couch, which of the boots had busted laces Levi's, and where the extra hand towels were kept in a basket in the corner of the pantry that everyone forgot existed. She learned that Owen liked his homework lined up in a neat stack at the edge of the table and would lose his pencil twice an evening no matter what he did. Molly wanted to braid everyone's hair and would accept a braid in the tail of the cat as a substitute if no human volunteered. Rose believed every glass of milk needed to be cheered before drinking. To bravery, she would declare, to chairs, and she would drink and set the glass down with a satisfied gasp. Levi read slowly, but when he laughed, it was as if a small bell had been rung somewhere in the house. On the third day, Caleb came in from the cold with his beard glittered, with frost and 4 pieces of mail tucked into his coat. He set the envelopes on the counter and unwrapped his scarf, watching Nora with a look that was not expectant so much as hopeful. "How is it, then?" he asked. She made a small gesture around the room. "It's a house," she said. "It makes sense." "Not always," he said, and smiled. It took a week for Nora to stop flinching at sudden noises. It took 2 for her to let herself laugh without checking to see who heard her at night, when the kids were asleep and the stove had mellowed to a steady glow. She would sit at the end of the couch with a cup of tea and look at the way the shadows played in the corners. The house had little noises she learned to trust. The tick of settling wood, the small sigh the front door made when the wind pushed and gave up, the faint drumming of Rose's feet when she forgot about bedtime and ran to ask one more question. One evening, while pulling out the mixing bowl from the pantry, Nora noticed a slip of paper tacked to the inside of the door. It was yellowed along one edge, as if it had been thumbed many times. Help wanted. It read, "Mountain home, for kids, room and board, small pay, must be willing to learn." The phone number was the same she had dialed from the station, but writing this was not neat. The letters were too big and tipped a little to the right. There was a doodle of a pine tree in the corner, simple and earnest. Nora lifted it carefully and brought it to the table where Caleb was wrapping a long-handled spoon with twine to fix a split. "This," she said, and set it down near his elbow, glanced at it, and went still. For a long moment he looked only at the paper, and then he looked up at Owen, who had paused in the doorway with a glass of water. "Owen," Caleb said, and there was something like surprise and tenderness braided together in his voice. "Did you put that ad up?" Owen's ears went a little red. He set his glass down and stood straighter, like he was preparing himself to be sent to chop wood or to write an apology. "We needed help," he said. He looked at Nora, and then back at his father. "You were trying so hard, and you were tired." He swallowed. "I didn't want us to get mean. Sometimes people get mean when they are tired." Caleb's mouth opened and closed again. "When did you put it up?" "Last month," Owen said, "when we went to town for the snow tires. You were talking to Mr. Kent at the counter. I took the marker from the register." Nora pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. She had come to this house on the hope of a child. Something inside her that had been shaken from the inside out came still. Caleb ran a hand over his beard and exhaled in a soft rush. "Well," he said finally, voice rough, "guess I got outvoted by a good man." After that, the house shifted. In small ways that meant a lot. When Molly turned her ankle sliding down the hill behind the barn, she limped into Nora's lap without thinking, and Nora set her there and wrapped ice in a towel and listened to the story of how the sled had gone faster than courage could manage. When Levi couldn't sleep, he came to stand in the doorway and whisper, "I have questions." Nora would pat the blanket beside her and say, "Ask." Rose, whose legs never stopped moving, learned to bring Nora the little things she needed. Without being asked, "Team Rose," would say, tapping her fist against her palm like a coach. "Team, team, team." One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Nora told Caleb about the doctor's words. She said them softly, as if they could shatter, but they did not. They were simply true. She told him about the man in town and the way money had crossed a kitchen table like a simple problem being solved. She told him about how her parents had called it a favor, and how the word had hurt as much as anything else. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he did not reach for her. He put his palm flat on the table, warm wood under warm skin. "You don't owe any person in this world your body or your future," he said, and his voice was so steady she could have fallen asleep. "On it, you don't owe me children, you don't owe me anything." Nora's breath left her on a small sound that was almost a laugh. She did not know, until that moment, how much she had wanted to hear those exact words. "2 of my kids aren't mine by blood." he added, a little later, when the kettle rattled and he stood to pour more water. Lila and I took in Levi and Rose when we had no business thinking we were ready. We learned fast. Family isn't, he paused, searching for the right word. It's not only one thing, she nodded. The kettle steamed between them like a soft curtain. There was a long and easy silence. It was not all easy, of course. Sometimes the mill changed shifts, and Caleb came home with a headache that made him squint at the lamplight. Sometimes Molly and Rose fought with a ferocity that startled them both, and both cried afterward from the shock of their own anger. Owen tried to take too much on, and it fell to Nora to remind him that being 13 was a job in itself. In the middle of all that, a letter arrived with a return address she recognized and did not want to see. It was small and official-looking. Inside, on clean white paper, were words from the man who had paid for her, written as if she were a debt he had taken on, as if she could be collected like a tool or a table. He said a great many things, none of them kind. He mentioned money, an obligation, and the way news traveled in a small town. Nora's hands shook as she read. She could feel the old fear, the kind that lives in the muscles, climb back up her spine and nest at the base of her neck. Caleb read the letter with his jaw set. Then he folded it with slow care and slid it back into the envelope. We're going to the sheriff, he said. Now, the sheriff's office was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The sheriff himself was a square man with a slow way of speaking. He read the letter. He listened to Nora's account without letting his eyes go anywhere else. When she finished, he lifted his hands and rested them on the desk. Ma'am, he said, no one belongs to anyone. He can't claim you. If he comes to your house or makes trouble, you call me anyway. If you can't sleep for thinking about this, we've got a porch light that stays on late. They drove home with the afternoon turning to blue and gold around them. Nora sat in the truck and watched the trees go by and felt a loosening that was not dramatic and not sudden. It was more like a knot that had been there a long time being worked free, thread by thread. When they pulled into the driveway, the kids were just getting off the school bus. They ran to the house in a cluster, book bags bouncing, scarves trailing, voices sharp and bright in the cold. Team Rose said solemnly when Nora opened the door, "We are all home." They made a ritual of quiet things. On Tuesdays, Nora set bread to rise by the stove so the scent would fill the house by afternoon. On Thursdays, Owen and Caleb worked on the old pickup together, their voices low and their hands dirty. Sunday mornings, Levi helped Nora make a simple cake, and they all ate it after dinner with spoons from the pan, laughing when the frosting stuck to their lips. When the snow finally came, it came in a serious way, and they went out together, and shoveled the steps and carved a small path to the mailbox, and the dog from next door followed them, trying to eat snowballs in the air and failing. Spring arrived shyly, at first with a few brave shoots near the porch and the sound of water moving again under the ice in the creek. Rose collected rocks, smooth and dull and precious in their plainness. Molly planted seeds in small pots on the kitchen sill and guarded them like a dragon with a hoard. Owen grew taller, Levi laughed more. Caleb took his jacket off during the day and rolled his sleeves to the elbow and fixed everything that winter had loosened. More than once, Nora thought of leaving, not because she wanted to, but because the feeling of belonging frightened her. Sometimes belonging felt like a ledger, like a thing that could be taken away if she breathed wrong. On one of those days, she found a note in her pocket she did not remember putting there. It was written in the same big letters as the ad in the pantry. It said simply, "Thank you for staying." It was not signed, but she didn't need it to be. The man who had written the letter to the house did not come. Another letter came from a lawyer months later, carefully worded, backing down first and then dissolving into silence. The sheriff stopped by once, in his uniform and new boots, and accepted a slice of cake and a chair by the stove. He told Levi about the time his cruiser had got stuck in a ditch in spring mud, and how an old farmer had pulled him out with a tractor while laughing the whole time. Levi's eyes had gone wide, and then delight had broken over his face like sunlight. Summer was noisy and green. They hung a rope swing between two pines and listened to the sound it made when someone swung high. That small whine of rope, that rushing sound of air. Molly went barefoot as often as she could. Rose learned to whistle and then did it constantly, a little off-key which made it better. Owen took to sitting on the porch with a book, long legs swung over the steps, offering the dog a scratch every now and then without looking away from the page. Sometime after the county fair and before the first yellow leaves began to appear on the maples, the question came in the simplest way. Levi was wiping the table very seriously with a dish towel, brow furrowed with the importance of his work. He stopped when he reached the end and stood there, towel loose in his hands. Nora, he asked, without turning around. Yes. Is it okay if sometimes I call you Mum? The room went still. Molly looked up from where she was stringing beads on a piece of thread. Owen didn't move but held his breath in the way she had come to recognize. Rose, who had been pretending to write checks for the family in a notebook, put her pencil down very carefully. Nora wiped her hands on a cloth with more attention than necessary. She walked over and rested a hand on Levi's head. His hair was soft at the nape and a little sweaty from play. If you want to, she said, you can try it. And if it feels right, you can keep it. And if it doesn't, we'll find what does. That night, when the house was quiet, she and Caleb sat on the edge of the porch steps and let the night gather around them. The air smelled like cut grass and something sweet from somewhere far away. Caleb cleared his throat. I'm not asking a thing that is too heavy, he said, so careful, but I need to tell you, the way I need to check the oil or make sure the stove is banked for the night. I love you. I love the way you stand at the window and check the weather like it might be trying to trick us. I love the way you tap the bread to hear if it's done. I love that this house sounds different when you're in it. Nora looked down at her hands. They were not smooth. There was a thin scar across the knuckle of her thumb from a pan that had slipped. She did not feel fragile. She did not feel like something someone could take from one place to another with a price. She felt like a person sitting on a porch in the summer dark, next to a man who had learned to talk quietly to keep from startling the deer, and to a family that had been built more on the decision to stay than on anything else. You don't have to, she said, and then shook her head and laughed at herself for starting that way. I mean, you don't owe me anything either, but I feel it too, in the way this place holds me, in the way it feels like I've always been walking up this path. He reached for her then, not fast, and she met his hand. They sat like that, for a long time, holding hands like a promise that did not have to be spoken over loud music or in a chapel. When they finally went inside, the house did the thing the house did best, which was to hold them in the warm center of it and make room for them to breathe. They married at the end of fall. It wasn't a show. It wasn't much more than a few people who had decided to stay assembled under the old maple by the fence line. The leaves were red and the air was that crisp kind of clean that makes the inside of your chest feel scrubbed. Owen wore a clean shirt and could not stop smiling in a lopsided way that made him look younger. Molly wore her hair in a braid that Nora and Caleb had made together, fingers stumbling and then finding a rhythm. Levi stood up very straight and took the ring from his pocket with the same care he would take carrying a full glass of milk. Rose threw pine needles like confetti and declared everyone a winner. They had no speeches. They had no cake taller than Nora's elbow. They had vows spoken in the kind of language that people use to get through snowstorms and to put a child back to sleep after a bad dream. Caleb promised to listen and to wait. Nora promised to stay and to forgive. The kids promised to put their boots where they belonged and to learn to make their own grilled cheese. Afterward, they stood around a table with platters of fried chicken and a bowl of apples, and the dog from next door made off with a biscuit and was forgiven immediately. Winter again. The bus line still ran out there beyond the trees. Sometimes, if the house was quiet and the wind came from the right direction, Nora could hear it from the porch, a far-off hum, a thread that tied this place to all the others. She stood there often at night, wrapped in a blanket over her coat, and watched the sky knit itself with stars inside. The kids slept in their rooms, their breaths like pages turning. The stove made its music. Caleb came to the doorway sometimes, and leaned his shoulder there, a silhouette with a familiar shape, and after a while, she would go to him and they would go inside together. The old fear did not come back. Exactly, it became something else. It became the sharp edge that helps. You remember that soft things are precious. When people asked later how she had come to be there, they expected a story with a hook. They expected something that would explain everything in one line. Nora would see their faces tilt, waiting. She would smile and say, I saw a note on a board, and followed it home, the morning after the first real snow, with drifts high as Molly's knees and the lights so bright off the field it made them squint. They went out with shovels and laughed when the snow slid off the porch roof like a wave. They made a crooked snowman with a carrot nose that Rose kept trying to bite. They came back inside pink-cheeked and loud, shedding boots and scarves, leaving damp marks on the floorboards. Nora took a towel and knelt to wipe them up. Caleb reached for the kettle. The kids piled like puppies on the couch. Nose too cold. Nose, telling the story of the snowman as if he were a hero who would live forever. Nora looked up and saw herself reflected in the window, a woman with hair pulled back, a sweater 2 shades too big, hands steady. Behind her, a house. In front of her, a world of white and green that would change and then change back. Again and again, she thought of the old kitchen, the envelope across the table, the way her parents could not meet her eyes. She did not need to forgive them to move forward. She did not need to forget. She turned back to the stove and lifted the kettle and held it as the steam curled up in a fragrant cloud. Tea, she asked. Cocoa, both Molly said, which made no sense, and everyone agreed. Drank, and they were quiet. It was the good kind of quiet. It was the kind that had room for everything, even the past, even the unknown. It was the kind that people make together when they have decided, each morning and each night, to stay. Nora could feel it, in her bones and in the small spaces around her heart. She could feel the way the house held its heat, and the way the world outside held its cold, and how she stood in the place between, part of both. She set down her mug, stood in the middle of the room for a second, and closed her eyes. I'm home, she said, softly, to the listening air, and the house, in its old wood and warm quiet, seemed to answer.